Good afternoon. I'm Pete Peterson, the very grateful Dean of Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy, and it is a delight to welcome you to our annual Constitution Day festivities. Today, we are just so honored to have our friends from Yeshiva University's Straus Center for Torah and Western Thought joining us to celebrate the Constitution and the roots of American order. I have mentioned this before. This is the second trip for our friends at the Straus Center to come to the School of Public Policy. The last event that we hosted here was back in 2019. Then you might remember there was a little worldwide pandemic that intervened. But I see this as really the continuance of a bi-coastal relationship of very like-minded institutions. To put a finer point on that, I wanted to read the mission statement for the Straus Center based at Yeshiva University, whose leaders and scholars will be speaking with you this afternoon. This is the mission statement. The Zahava and Michelle Straus Center for Torah and Western Thought trains Yeshiva University students to be modern Orthodox intellectual leaders who are well-versed in both Torah and the Western canon. Through a combination of unique interdisciplinary courses taught in collaboration with faculty from across YU, communal events, and publications, the Straus Center seeks to cultivate the intellectual, religious, and civic leaders of tomorrow. I wanted to put that right next to a passage from a speech that was given at the opening of the School of Public Policy. Many of you know that last year we celebrated our 25th anniversary at the school. And in that celebration, through a series of events and speeches that I gave, I went back into the founding documents of the School of Public Policy as it launched in 1997 and found an amazing speech given by the late, great California historian Kevin Starr, who also joined our faculty at the beginning there in 97, in which he gave a speech on February 4th, 1997, at really what was the opening announcement for the school that would fully open its doors that fall. This is a passage from that speech. Quote, "Because Pepperdine remains anchored in values, it can communicate itself to the region as not seeking just numbers and statistics, not fancy formulations, but value in our public life, by which I mean both religious and philosophic value, the Philosophia Perennis, the perennial philosophy, and the Judeo-Christian tradition which has shaped our civilization. It is only rarely that academic discourse directly refers to these values, yet they remain implicit in what is being thought and said." Well, we're not going to make these things implicit today. We are going to talk them straight out. And for many reasons, both, I hope you saw the connection between that passage and the mission of the Straus Center, because in so many ways we are tasked with that same responsibility, yea, 3,000 miles away, but connected in so many ways. I'm sure many of you saw the Waves of Flag display that we have down at the front of campus commemorating 9/11. I was in New York on that day, and to see a university that commemorates that day so solemnly and poignantly is a real witness of God's work in my own life, that He has brought me to this place 3,000 miles away and brought people like our friends at the Straus Center here to join us, because I really do see our two institutions, the Straus Center and the School of Public Policy, as being two lighthouses for defending these principles, and not just defending them, promoting them and teaching them to the next generation of civic leaders. I've also said that this is a personal thing for me. I was born not far from the campus at Yeshiva University in New York City, in a hospital that used to be called Columbia Presbyterian. Now it's New York Presbyterian, just not very far away from the campus of Yeshiva University. Soon after my birth, my parents were wise to take me to the other side of the GW Bridge, what I call God's country, which, as we all know, is the great state of New Jersey, where I continued my maturation process. But for those left back in New York City, we are so grateful to have them here. So this is going to be a series of 4 lectures, each given by a scholar from the Straus Center, led by their director, Rabbi Dr. Meir Soloveichik. And then, so you know the agenda, after those 4 lectures are complete, we will then meet here at the table, and all 4 will be available for your questions. So please keep track of your questions as we go along and save them for the Q&A portion at the end. All right? I'm so happy to see so many friends here today. Students, actually, if we could get some of our students here to stand, our graduate policy students who have joined us today and are part of what we do in preparing that next generation. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming a great and dear friend, Rabbi Dr. Meir Soloveichik.
Well, it's amazing to be here with all of you, and I want to thank Pete Peterson for so warmly welcoming us to the campus. It's because of my incredible esteem for the work that he does that I was willing to tear myself away from the natural beauty of Manhattan to come to this disgusting neighborhood that you see before you. Before I begin, let me briefly dissent from Dean Peterson's statement about the worthiness of leaving New York for New Jersey. The only good reason for leaving New York for New Jersey is the reason why Washington's army went from New York to New Jersey, because they were being chased by the British. Otherwise, there is no good reason. And as we say in New York, if you want to know why New Yorkers are depressed, it's because for us, the light at the end of the tunnel is New Jersey. So, but otherwise, I agree with Pete Peterson on everything. So, but with that dissent in mind, I couldn't resist saying that in the name of truth. And now for my presentation. We gather to mark the advent of Constitution Day. And we must begin by reflecting how remarkable it is that there is such a day when we discuss and celebrate a text, and of course, the text that surround it, the text that embody the American idea. The late Chief Rabbi of England, my very much missed friend, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, describes the first time that he visited Washington, D.C. in the 1960s. And he tells us that he went to visit the presidential memorials, Lincoln, Jefferson, etc. And he was struck by the fact that along with images, statues of these men, etched onto the walls are the texts, the words, the ideas most affiliated with them. He described it as follows. He said, "What fascinated me was that each came with its own texts. The Lincoln Memorial had the Gettysburg Address on one side, and on the other, the second inaugural. And so with the others. I suddenly realized," Rabbi Sachs said, "that American memorials are not just to be seen, but also to be read. It's the exact opposite in London. Go to Parliament Square," said Rabbi Sachs, "and you will see that the memorial to David Lloyd George has just 3 words. David Lloyd George. Benjamin Disraeli gets 2. Benjamin and Disraeli. And for Churchill," by the way, for whom language was kind of important, as for Churchill, he gets just 1, Churchill. "So what," said Rabbi Sachs. I know, right? British people are the worst. Okay, no. "So what," said Rabbi Sachs, "are we to make of this?" He said, "The difference between the American and British monuments is unmistakable, and the reason is that Britain and the United States have a quite different political and moral culture. England is, or was until recently, a tradition-based society. In such societies, it is unnecessary to ask why. Those who belong know. Those who need to ask show thereby that they don't belong. But American society," Rabbi Sachs further said, "is different because from the Pilgrim Fathers onward, it was based on the concept of covenant as set out in Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, especially in Exodus and Deuteronomy." And he further added, Covenant societies represent conscious new beginnings. They are founded on an idea dedicated to a proposition. Rabbi Sachs was right. At the heart of the Hebrew Bible, at the heart of the story of biblical Israel, is the concept of covenant, or in Hebrew, brit. The story of a people liberated from Egypt from the purpose of covenanting at Sinai, uniting around a text, which Jews call the Torah, a text of laws, doctrines, and ideas. And so to mark a Constitution Day is to reflect how America is a country defined by its dedications to words and to texts. And also, and this is more the theme that many of us will be speaking about, the way in which the Hebraic concept of covenant and Hebraic political concepts impacted the covenantal nature of the United States. Truth is, when I first heard this from Rabbi Sachs about words versus images, I began seeing it everywhere, because I travel a lot. And so if you look in gift shops anywhere on earth, what they're selling is images. So if you go to Heathrow in London, no one's selling replicas of the Magna Carta. It's just not happening. What's for sale is not text, but images. You can get pictures of the Queen, and of course now the King, pictures of palaces. I myself have a coffee mug from the gift shop of Kensington Palace that depicts, that has pictures of Henry VIII and his 6 wives. And when you pour hot water into the mug, the 6 wives disappear. But only in America, would you find a souvenir like this. A tie with the Constitution on it. Article 1, Article 2, we the people. I didn't wear it today because, I didn't want to be too classy. But still, only a society once impacted by the Hebrew Bible, only a country that at least once thought of itself as having a biblically inspired covenantal culture would define itself by ideas so that you can have something like this. And so, as one example of the Hebraic impact on America, which is our theme for today, and of the unfolding of an Hebraic idea in American history, I would like to discuss today one of the most famous but also most misunderstood symbols of our nation, the Liberty Bell. It's often assumed that the name Liberty Bell derives from the fact that it was rung on July 4th, 1776, to mark the advent of independence. And that's absolutely true, except for the fact that no details about that are true at all. The association stems from a story published in the 1840s by George Lippard. George Lippard, not the great actor and thespian George Pepperdine from the A-Team, the artistic achievement of our age, but rather George Lippard, describing an elderly man in 1776 charged with ringing the State House bell when independence was announced. This is the story that made the Liberty Bell forever affiliated with July 4th. But the entire tale is fiction. While the bell would have been rung to celebrate American independence, it would have been one of many sounded in the city, and only on July 8th, several days after the Congress's fateful decision. But the true tale of the bell and the family that brought it into being is interesting enough, and it is indeed bound up with the unique story of American liberty, containing a profound lesson for our own time as well. The story begins in 1701 with William Penn enshrining in Pennsylvania a Charter of Liberties guaranteeing freedom of conscience. For Penn, a Quaker, true friendship with God and man, true friendship between God and man could not be coerced. Or as he put it, there can be no friendship where there is no freedom. Penn's agent in the region was a man by the name of James Logan, who was later mayor of Philadelphia. The historian Edwin Wolfe describes how James Logan, quote, bought himself Hebrew Bibles and Hebrew prayer books and read them and made notes in them. When he was more fluent, he added a Shulchan Aruch, that's the code of Jewish law, and the great 6-volume edition of the Mishnah with Maimonides and Bar Tanura commentaries. This guy's not Jewish, I just want to point this out. In fact, Logan gathered together in Philadelphia in the first half of the 18th century one of the largest collections of Hebraica which existed in frontier America. So Edwin Wolfe writes, Logan then taught Hebrew to his daughter Sally, whom he described as a child, quote, reading the 34th Psalm in Hebrew, the letters of which she learned very perfectly in less than 2 hours' time. Sally, in turn, married Isaac Norris, Speaker of the State Assembly. Norris was a Hebraist in his own right, though his father-in-law, amusingly, was unimpressed And this is the first time ever in the history of mankind that a father-in-law was unimpressed with his son-in-law. And he wrote about the man who married his daughter, quote, "If he had as much skill in ye Greek as he has in Hebrew, he would merit the general reputation of a learned man." It was from this Hebraic household that the bell emerged. In 1751, Isaac Norris commissioned the bell from Whitechapel Bell Foundry in London, the oldest bell foundry in England. But alas, when the bell arrived in America, it did not work, and it had to be recast, melted down and recast by American craftsmen whose names are now on the Liberty Bell. Anybody know their names? Pass and Stowe. I heard somebody say, who knew Pass and Stowe? Excellent. You clearly knew that because you saw the important documentary National Treasure, in which a Pass and Stowe figure very prominently. Norris chose to emblazon the bell with words from Leviticus, describing how every 50 years indentured servants are freed. Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. Ukratem deror ba'aretz l'chol yoshvea in Hebrew. It is a jubilee, and each man shall return to his heritage, each man to his family. The chosen verse reflects a deep knowledge of the Hebrew text, and only a Hebraist who truly understood the 50-year calendar of the biblical system and the jubilee's role in ending servitude would have chosen such a verse. He was marking 50 years to the Pennsylvania Charter of Liberties. And so he chose the verse about the 50th year jubilee in which liberty was celebrated, in which liberty was proclaimed throughout all the land. Thus, there is a biblical verse about liberty on the bell, but for decades after, including at 1776, it was not known as the Liberty Bell. It was called the State House Bell. It was only after America's Second Great Awakening that others truly came to appreciate the bell's biblical context as well. Anti-slavery advocates chose the bell because of its verse, because they understood its Hebraic context. They renamed it the Liberty Bell and chose it as a symbol of the abolitionist cause. Thus, one abolitionist paper wrote, "May not the emancipationists in Philadelphia hope to live to hear the same bell rung when liberty shall in fact be proclaimed to all the inhabitants of this favored land." And another writer wrote, "The Liberty Bell is fixed on the world's watchtower. So," this writer added, "so will its cheering tones ever ring out amid freedom's passes until every chain shall be broken and one loud shout shall proclaim the glorious jubilee of universal emancipation." Thus the bell and the verse upon it embody how biblical imagery inspired not just early Americans, but also the assault on slavery and the advancement of the American idea. That whereas, while of course slavery was the great contradiction to the American idea at the very moment of the founding, what begins to emerge in this abolitionist movement is the opposition to slavery, though you had opponents even at the moment of the founding, but especially after the Great Awakening, what you see is an opposition to slavery that's engaged by joining the Bible to the American ideal of equality. As the great American historian Gordon Wood put it, whereas slavery existed throughout much of the world, quote, "It's the American Revolution that makes it a problem for the world, and the first real anti-slave movement takes place in North America." So he wrote. So the Second Great Awakening inspires a revivified, a strong abolitionist movement with biblical themes providing the abolitionist imagery. If we then move ourselves forward to the 20th century, we see another use of the Liberty Bell. By then, the Liberty Bell had gone silent, cracked by being rung on Washington's birthday or around Washington's birthday in the 19th century. Nevertheless, it was still utilized for the advancement of liberty and equality. On D-Day, Philadelphia Mayor Bernard Samuel chose to utilize the Liberty Bell for this purpose. And thus we are told that by the website of the Liberty Bell, of the Liberty Bell National Park, that, and you can find this online, the mayor took a mallet and struck the bell. It wasn't the usual sound, but he struck it with a mallet 7 times to parallel the 7 letters in the word liberty. And then this sound was broadcast across the seas to the soldiers that were about to land to liberate Europe in D-Day. And the larger point, I think, is that though the Liberty Bell seemingly no longer rang, nevertheless, as these soldiers fought, as they acted, as they risked life and limb to save liberty, then the Liberty Bell, in a certain sense, was not silent. They heard it, not just over the radio, but in the very fibers of their being. By acting on behalf of the American ideal, through their very actions, they quite figuratively, if not literally, let freedom ring. And this point was reflected upon by Ronald Reagan in his great speech at Pointe du Hoc, where he said the following: "The Americans who fought here that morning knew word of the invasion was spreading through the darkness back home. They fought, or felt in their hearts, though they couldn't know, in fact, that in Georgia they were filling the churches at 4 a.m., in Kansas they were kneeling on their porches and praying, and in Philadelphia they were ringing the Liberty Bell. Something else," said Reagan, "helped the men of D-Day, their rock-hard belief that Providence would have a great hand in the events that would unfold here, that God was an ally in this great cause. That night," Reagan added, "General Matthew Ridgway, on his cot, listening in the darkness for the promise God made to Joshua, 'I will not fail thee nor forsake thee.' These are the things that impelled them. These are the things that shaped the unity of the Allies." Thus we have a Hebraic bell inspired by Jewish law, with Hebraic words, ringing out as a clarion call through the actions of Americans as Europe was liberated by tyranny. It is fitting, therefore, that one of the most resonant symbols of American liberation from tyranny is a result of that liberation of the American allies. And here I share with you another symbol of the bond between the Torah and America, but one much less known than the Liberty Bell. After the war, with many Jews in Europe, the survivors of the Holocaust, living as DPs, displaced persons, several rabbis and Jewish scholars from among the survivors asked the leaders of the American armed forces for help in publishing a copy of the Talmud, of the rabbinic commentary on the Torah, so that the Jews in DP camps could once again study the Torah that they loved so much. They had no access to Judaic texts for many years. Now, one might have expected the army to refuse this request. After all, their job was to liberate Europe and secure the peace, not to go into the Jewish book business. But amazingly, the army agreed, believing that the preservation of Jewish ideas against totalitarian forces of evil was an essential embodiment of the American way, thereby highlighting the profound bond between American ideas and Judaic texts. So the army requisitioned a printing plant in Heidelberg, which during the war had printed Nazi propaganda. And in 1948, it published 500 sets of the Talmud, what is known to this day as the U.S. Army Talmud. It is the only time in the history of the Jews that a national government has published an edition of our law. One can only imagine what the ardent secularists that give their own interpretation of the Establishment Clause would have made of the United States Armed Forces printing 500 copies of the Talmud. But it just so happens that I have an edition of that Talmud, and I have schlepped with me, not the whole set, but just one of the volumes, just to show you, just out of dedication to Pete Peterson, because at the time I didn't know that he came from New Jersey. So here you have it. You see on the front page it says you have a picture of Jerusalem and then of the concentration camp. And then here, these are the only English words that appear. And it reads as follows. This edition of the Talmud is dedicated to the United States Army. This army played a major role in the rescue of the Jewish people from total annihilation, and after the defeat of Hitler, bore the major burden of sustaining the displaced persons of the Jewish faith. This special edition of the Talmud, published in the very land where, but a short time ago, everything Jewish and of Jewish inspiration was anathema, will remain a symbol of the indestructibility of the Torah. The Jewish DPs will never forget the generous impulses and the unprecedented humanitarianism of the American forces, to whom they owe so much. And so we find, if you think about it, suddenly, in this one volume, an incredible bond between two covenantal peoples, the displaced persons of the Jewish people from Europe and the American people. One inspired by the ideas of the other, now in turn helping to preserve and advance the ideas of the Jewish people themselves. One of the most striking bonds between America and the Jewish people themselves. And thus we find suddenly that the original verse emblazoned on the Liberty Bell was suddenly applied in an unforeseen way, with the soldiers actually reifying that very verse, proclaim liberty throughout all the land, and each man shall return to his heritage. The U.S. Army Talmud highlights how America is a country where the impact of the Torah unfolded in remarkable ways, leading it to better proclaim liberty throughout its land and beyond its land, throughout the lands. Strikingly, the original sound of liberty in the Torah, of course, was not a bell. When the Torah tells us to proclaim liberty throughout the land, what is being spoken of is not a bell, but rather a shofar, a ram's horn, which we will be sounding several days from now on Rosh Hashanah. And the shofar, of course, is itself the sound of Sinai, which was first sounded at the very moment of our founding. It is today the link to Sinai, for those who study American idea, is in danger of being lost. It's very striking that in 1976, when America prepared to mark its bicentennial, the Whitechapel Foundry in London sought to repent for the fact that it had sent a lemon to Isaac Norris. And this was perhaps inspired by the fact that there was a group of about 30 or so demonstrators that got themselves together as a prank, Americans, and gathered in London to protest. And they called themselves the Procrastinator Society of America. And they mounted a mock protest over the bell's defects. And they marched up and down in front of the Whitechapel Foundry in London around July 4th, 1976, with signs that said, "We got a lemon," and "What about the warranty?" And then, and I'm citing this from the website of the Whitechapel Foundry, Whitechapel Foundry issued a statement, and they said, "We told them," meaning the Americans, "we would be happy to replace the bell as long as it was returned to us in its original packaging." Meanwhile, at the precise moment in America marking the bicentennial, Queen Elizabeth was visiting Philadelphia, and the government of Great Britain decided to present a special gift to the American people. A bell, a replica of the Liberty Bell, made by the Whitechapel Foundry, a Liberty Bell being given by a descendant of George III in order to show that there were no hard feelings. It's a lovely gesture, but strikingly, if you look at the image of that gift, the bell recast by Whitechapel in 1976 is boldly emblazoned by Britain with the words, "Let freedom ring," but it lacks the Levitical verse, the extraordinary link between the American conception of liberty and the heritage of the Jewish people. The story of the bell reminds us, therefore, that if we hearken accordingly to its message, its sound, once rung, can be heard generations later. But the opposite is also a possibility. In the biblical, the opposite is also a possibility, especially when we realize that the original sound of liberty was the shofar, the sound of Sinai. In Deuteronomy's description of Sinai, we are given an ambiguous Hebrew phrase. The voice of Sinai is described as a kol gadol velo yasaf, which can be read either as a voice that will never be heard again, a sound that will never be heard again, or the opposite, a sound that will never cease. The truth is that either one is possible. Perhaps the point is that it is up to us. The call of Sinai, the sound of Scripture, the call of the true meaning of liberty, will not cease if we continue to allow it to be heard. Understood this way, the verse reflects that the fact that whether the message of the Bible continues to ring depends not on our ancestors but on ourselves. That as long as we remain loyal to the principles of that moment, then the sound will continue to be made manifest among us. But otherwise, that sound will fall silent. This is a lesson, I think, not only for Jews, of course, but for Americans. For if the story of American liberty was so bound up with the Bible, then when the sound of Sinai ceases in America, when the call of the Bible wanes, when knowledge of the Bible and its profound connection is weakened, then we are in danger not only of forgetting the principles of the Bible bequeathed to us, but of ceasing to think about ourselves as a covenantal society at all, of ceasing to focus on the ideas that make us Americans. I was recently sent a clip from an episode of Jeopardy that aired, I think, not so long ago. To get on Jeopardy, you have to be pretty educated. And the clue on Jeopardy was, it was in this biblical book that one finds the verse, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." That's the call. The answer, of course, is Psalms. I think actually the category was silent P, I think. I could be wrong. But the contestants are just staring blankly until the buzzer comes. The truth is that we live in an age that is, to a great extent, disconnected from the biblical idea, from biblical ideas that helped make this country what it was. And we live as well in an age with so many distractions. We live in a cacophonous cocoon of digital distractions, so that it's all too difficult for the sound of Sinai to actually penetrate. It therefore falls to us, to those that truly care about the ideas that helped give America its birth and that made it what it was, to make those ideas ring among us again. In 2004, on the 60th anniversary of D-Day, the people of Normandy dedicated a near-exact replica of the bell and rang it over the cliffs of Normandy. An article describes how this was done. Quote, "To preserve the Liberty Bell, it is no longer struck with a mallet or anything else, but throughout the past 150 years, many attempts have been made to discern and even reproduce the original E-flat of the Liberty Bell." And we are told, in 2004, we're told as follows: as the West celebrated the 60th anniversary of D-Day, and British-led force by American and British-led forces, the people of Normandy dedicated a near-exact 2,077-pound replica of the bell, made with the same alchemy of copper and tin as the original. On D-Day of 2004, the article further tells us, it was rung on the cliffs of Normandy. Do you hear that? That is a very special sound from the 18th century, said Paul Bergamo, of the Cornell Harvard foundry which cast the replica bell. That is the sound Benjamin Franklin heard when he was working on the Constitution of the United States. Thus did the sound of the Liberty Bell ring over the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc. Proclaim liberty throughout all the lands. We cannot fail to see this as a reminder of our obligation to preserve the true tone of the bell, the Hebraic grammar of American liberty, until more Americans are willing to hear it again. It is to this cause that we call ourselves just days before the Jewish New Year, when we will gather all over the world, Jews will gather, to sound the shofar, the original supreme call of liberty. I thank all of you, as we prepare for that day, for the opportunity to explain my own thoughts about the uniqueness of this covenantal nation, to describe the beacon of liberty that its texts embody, and to express the hope that the exceptional nature of this republic endures. Thank you very much.
Two summers ago, one of the great wonders of the literary world, Shakespeare's first folio, was up for sale at Sotheby's in New York. And while for me, to own or not to own was definitely out of the question, I just had to be in the room where it happened. So a few minutes before the auction was to begin, the room was still rather empty. But since the pandemic pushed a lot of online auctions to shift operations mostly online, I didn't take that sparse attendance as representative or reflective of collector or maybe even collective disinterest. But looking back, maybe I should have. The auctioneer opened the bidding at $100,000, and 2 minutes and $2 million later, the folio had a new private owner. What happened after that, though, was much more remarkable. The next item up for the auction was a copy of the first edition of the Geneva Bible. And this was the Bible translated from Hebrew and Greek, originally printed in English in 1560. And this particular copy was bound together also with a collection of the whole book of Psalms, collected and adapted into English meter through the consultation of the Hebrew. And I briefly entertained the thought that maybe this was the version of the Geneva Bible that Shakespeare had at hand when he was writing his masterpieces that referenced over 1,000 biblical allusions throughout. For half a century, the Geneva Bible was the dominant Bible in England, in Protestant England, until King James authorized his new version. And as Julie Upgrave and other scholars have shown, the difference was that in the King James Version, the editors decided to exclude all those pesky, seditious marginal notes that did things like appear to suggest the legitimacy of overstepping or resisting a ruler, or the frequent use of the word tyrant, which James explicitly forbade in his translation. So in general, the Geneva Bible was considered to have encouraged political readings of Scripture. For instance, in this slide, while the Geneva gloss for the verse from Psalm 146, the declaration, "Put not your trust in princes," underscores and maybe even censures human tendency to misplace our trust in our own kind. The King James Bible skips that and instead overlooks any trace of social criticism, and instead it doubles down on the divine as the only source of salvation. Indeed, the Geneva Bible remained supreme, or at least reigned supreme, into the 17th century until James had to actually issue a ban against printing new versions of the Geneva so that his text could compete. So taking us back to the Geneva Bible, I'll start the bidding at 100,000. Do I hear 100,000? No. Well, on that day, no one else did either, because the bids that came in were under the seller's reserve price and the Bible wasn't bought. Yeah, we should get some funding for that, maybe. The Straus Center. Be nice to have. But just after that, the next two items that came up in rapid succession was a previously unrecorded copy of the official Massachusetts printing of the Declaration of Independence that had been folded for quick dispatch, and the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights from the 1788 Virginia Convention that was intended to be sent to one of the other states. And apparently, when in the course of human events, you have the opportunity to purchase American history, people are willing to spend between $2 and $3 million. So if we look at material culture and perhaps think about what insight it can give us and how society views different forms of wisdom, from Shakespeare's exploration of the human condition to the Founding Fathers' ratification of rights and freedoms, on that Manhattan morning, I kind of felt sorry for Scripture. And it wasn't the first time. In 2016, the King James Bible was up for sale. It sold for close to $400,000. Sounds good, except 4 years later, Shakespeare's Folio was also up for sale. And after broker's fees and buyer's premium, about $10 million.
So, thank you, Fernanda. And that was just the hammer.
That was that. There's a gap that we can read into. So yes, auctions are not representative of domestic markets, but sometimes we can maybe take a look at how they reflect the edges of what the market might bear and where consumer interest lies. Rare editions of the Bible have rarely gone for over six figures, while Shakespeare's folios have always gone for over six figures in the last few decades. So these gaping numbers suggest that the perceived monetary, or maybe even the perceived moral value of the bard has been eclipsed, or the bard's value has eclipsed the Bible in the 21st century. That is, until we look at a very particular section of Scripture. So in 2013, the Bay Psalm book, which was the first book printed in North America in 1640, set the world record price for a book sold at auction at $13 million. And this Psalter in particular is really interesting. It is only one of 11 remaining copies of the original 1700 that were printed. And the Psalms of the Hebrew Bible are not only of inestimable value to Western literature and culture, but to America's founding in particular. So to think a little bit about where that text traces itself back to, in Jewish tradition, King David, the sweet singer of Israel, composed a significant portion of Sefer Tehillim, the Book of Psalms, with numerous chapters that are attributed to other authors as well. And the Hebrew introductory terms, mizmor, shir, maskil, all of these indicate that the Psalms were intended to be sung. They were used for musical performance, instruments were involved, and later they were used to accompany the Levite choir on the steps of the temple. Now, there are several poetic expressions and sections included throughout all of the Hebrew Bible that record God's greatness. They convey divine messages, including the desire for a relationship with his creations. But the Psalms uniquely give us insight into the earthbound efforts of seeking a relationship with God. Now, according to the rabbinic writers of the Midrash, everything that David says in his book, he said corresponding to himself, to Israel, and to all times. And as such, its 150 chapters have been recited for centuries by Jews seeking protection, prosperity, penance, fortitude, an expansion of wisdom, and an ending of exile. Yet the particularism of Israel's experience encapsulated in the Psalms found universal appeal in various communities and contexts. And as Adam Kirsch has argued, that it was Christianity that managed to disseminate the Psalms throughout Europe and in the world in a scale that their composers could never have imagined. During the 16th century, in addition to the psalters that were formally commissioned by monarchs as heads of the church, the Psalms were translated and printed more than any other book. They were read, they were memorized, they were sung more than ever before, to the point that they were now thoroughly embedded in the lives of English citizens, from personal diary entries to the public theater. As poet and Anglican cleric John Donne averred, the Psalms were the manna of the church, and that they too tasted to everyone like that he liked best, and they ministered instruction and satisfaction in every emergency and in every occasion. And while the Psalms their consistent position throughout was that God never abandons the oppressed, it's really little wonder that they appealed to persecuted Christian reformers and writers like Luther and Milton and the Puritans, who compared themselves to Israelites embarking through the wilderness toward a new promised land. Following the Pilgrims, the Puritans arrived in Massachusetts in the late 1620s, and not long after, they realized that in the New World, they lacked one of the great objects of education and learning. And it wasn't Zoom. It was a printing press. Because without that, it was really impossible to proceed. The printing press would have been essential in making the Bible available for study, and it was key to their mission of living a godly life and then setting that as an example for others. So the first step in solving their intertwined religious and pedagogical problem was, of course, to order a printing press. Now, Amazon Prime did not exist, and unfortunately, the machine operator that traveled over with the printing press did not survive the journey. But his widow and his apprentice did, and together they managed to set up America's first printing press in 1639. The next question, of course, is what do we print? So the colony's committee of 30 elders, including John Cotton and Richard Mather, knew that they needed a book that was both utilitarian and theologically significant. And it didn't take long for a work of singular import to appear. As a sacred text, the Psalms were central to religious practice. Every family in the Massachusetts Bay Colony would have taken a psalter to church for singing, and it was part of the liturgy, and they used it at home for Bible study. And while a practical choice, printing a new book of Psalms also offered a unique political opportunity. We know that every act of representation is an act of interpretation. And it was the received translation of this Hebrew Psalms that the Puritans really sought to correct. So in the preface to The whole book of Psalms, faithfully translated into English meter, that was quickly adopted in every congregation in the colony and then colloquially known as the Base Psalm Book, the compilers address the corrective path of their project, noting that while they were appreciative of the religious endeavors of the learned men that came before them, Mather and his companions found that their texts offered more paraphrase than translation. There were frequent additions and detractions and alterations to the sacred text, and in fact managed to minister more offense. Although Puritan translators strived to restore the native purity of the original Hebrew content and cadence, many have actually found their lyricism a bit lacking. Take, for instance, their rendering of Psalm 23. So in the King James translation, which really closely follows the Hebrew, as it begins, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." We can see clearly this translation working more with the Hebrew. But the aberrations, the paraphrase, the variations are also very prevalent and noticeable in the other translation, or adaptation, I would rather say, by Whittingham that was very, very popular beforehand. And in this case, row E, my shepherd, is completely displaced by the concept of support. And instead of lying down, we're left standing. So the translation has maybe some to be desired, yet they maintain the meter here for singing. So therefore, to restore the literal meaning of Scripture, but also preserve meter for singing in service, the Base Psalm book vectors those verses as follows. "The Lord is my shepherd, the Lord my shepherd is, want therefore I shall not." Almost. Although Robert Frost likely had something very different in mind when he said that poetry is what gets lost in translation, his quip befits really, I think, the clunkiness of the Base Psalm book, which was really designed to be more functional than it was beautiful. For 20th century American musicologist Irving Loewens, he says that the Base Psalm book really is the predictable result of a committee of divines who are more distinguished for piety than their poetic prowess. But still, beyond its religious significance, reprinting the Psalms was a material act of nonconformity. From the point of view of our world here in America, Sotheby's David Redden says that the Base Psalm book marks the beginning of our Western civilization. Indeed, its spiritual and intellectual influence extended far past Puritan pulpits. The copy that Sotheby's sold in 2013 had belonged to Boston's Old Story Church, established in 1669, and it was one of many that was originally used by church prayergoers and patrons over the times, including members like Samuel Adams, Paul Revere's cooperative William Dawes, and a very young Benjamin Franklin. And it was from the Base Psalm book that some of the country's earliest thinkers first encountered the ideas that would inspire a nation. By the time the delegates gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress in 1774, they represented a variety of Christian communities, Episcopalians, Quakers, Presbyterians, Anabaptists, Congregationalists, but they were far from a monolithic whole. So when it was proposed that the meeting commence with prayer, there was much debate about whether it was appropriate to do so, and if so, then which denomination's minister should lead the service. So Samuel Adams, who declared that he was no bigot and could hear a prayer from any pious patriot, recommended Episcopal clergyman Jacob Duché, who was promptly summoned. So the very next day, as a small number of Jews congregated less than 2 miles down the way to pray on the high holiday of Rosh Hashanah, Duché, too, invoked the words of King David to convene the assembly in Carpenter's Hall. And he chose to recite Psalm 35, which summons divine force against foes. It promises collective rejoicing of God favoring righteous cause. And as I discovered yesterday, it miraculously brings about alternative travel plans when your flight gets canceled. So it was very helpful last night. Duché then offered a spontaneous prayer to follow that for the success of their collective mission. John Adams, later in recounting this event to his wife in a letter, marveled, saying, "It seemed as if heaven had ordained that psalm to be read that morning." And then he adds, "I must beg you to read that psalm. It would be thought providential." The American founding is full of complexity, with numerous theological and ideological crosscurrents. Yet, as my colleagues at the Straus Center have argued, the impact of the Hebrew Bible, as represented in the country's earliest relationship with the Psalms, exists alongside Cato's letters and the philosophy of John Locke and Plutarch's exemplars of civic leadership and moral purpose. Yet the animating spirit of the Psalms extends beyond just the nation's nascence. If, as Percy Shelley asserted, that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world, then America's authors have both charted and challenged the country's sense of civic and moral virtue through their verses, often using Tehillim as their touchstone. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow came of age in a young nation and achieved great renown at home and abroad as the predominant American poet of his day. With an eye for an antiquity and an ear for hymnody, Longfellow wrote for a country that felt the strongest stirrings of aspirational promise, but would come to know the deepest levels of personal and political tragedy. For a long time, Longfellow was drawn toward Jewish literature and history, and he even penned a very eloquent elegy upon visiting the Jewish cemetery in Newport. And in his poem, A Psalm of Life, Longfellow adapts the ancient Israelite mode to represent the American spirit regarding strife as a key component of progress. Dust thou art, to dust thou returnest, was not spoken of the soul, as he reminds his readers, and urges them to act in the living present, here within and God overhead. And for half a century, Longfellow served as the voice of a people hyper-attentive to history-making and of their own footprints on the sands of time. Similarly attuned to the spiritual and political dimensions of poetry, Ralph Waldo Emerson sounded the call for a voice that would rise to the occasion of a new nation in 1844, and Walt Whitman's response still resounds to this day. While Whitman pioneered what is now considered an essentially American free verse in Leaves of Grass, as my colleague and Whitman scholar Matt Miller finds in his study of the poet's creative process, that Whitman was aware that his lines seemed biblical is undeniable, and he was surely influenced, even if only unconsciously, by English translations of the Bible's Hebraic rhythms. Later in life, after seeing the horrors of civil war up close serving as a nurse, he wrote a little-known poem right before he passed away called Death's Valley. And like David, here the poet feels in the midst God's beautiful eternal right hand, ever present in the stricture knot called life. Whitman offers us a complicated but unflappable faith in God and faith in a country that is at once expansive and inclusive and life-affirming. And American wordsmiths from Anne Bradstreet, contemporary up to Amanda Gorman, have been stretched by the structural and the spiritual elements of the Psalms. And though the average reader today, as Rabbi Soloveichik pointed out, and as I think everyone in this room is keenly aware, might miss these biblical valences of these verses, the imprint of the Hebrew Bible is found on the strands of rhyme across American shores. And when the psalmist wrote that God's words are more desirable than gold, I don't think he was anticipating the modern auction market. However, I do think the sentiment holds true just the same. Just a few months ago, a decade after the record-breaking sale of the Bayes Psalm book, Sotheby's held another historic auction in New York City. And this time, it was standing room only, as the Codex Sassoon Bible, the Hebrew Bible dating to the late 9th or earliest century, was put on the auction block, this foundational cornerstone to civilization, and arguably the most influential book in human history. And it was sold for $38.1 million. And its purchase price far exceeds any of Shakespeare's folios, and I think the bard would have found poetic justice in that. Rather than going into the hands of a private collector, however, the codex was purchased to be put as a permanent part of an exhibit at the Anu Museum in Israel. And even though it will reside behind tempered glass, its priceless ancient wisdom is freely available to all. From revolutionary rhetoric to American abolition to modern-day diplomacy and public policy, the evocative imagery and the moral inspiration of the Psalms has moved history forward, as we like to say at Yeshiva University. Over 400 years ago, Shakespeare wondered, is it not strange that sheep's guts should hail souls out of men's bodies? Perhaps. But it is my fervent hope that the chords once struck by David's harp continue to compel us toward the fullest expressions of peace, prosperity, and purpose. Thank you.
So for better or worse, I think I'm going to be the first speaker in the history of Constitution Day events at Pepperdine to start with the following question. Raise your hand if you've ever eaten challah bread. Okay, awesome. So does everyone who's eaten challah, which is seemingly all of you, know the origin story of challah and Superman? In 1938, in Cleveland, Ohio, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster sketched out the initial draft of Superman on Joe Shuster's mom's challah baking board. This is the true Hebraic origin of Superman. Now, very few Americans know this story. Some know that Stan Lee, another Jew, invented Spider-Man, Bob Kane invented Batman. This is somewhat well known. But much less well known is the fact that way before Marvel Comics, there were ancient Avengers, the Hebrew Bible's heroes, who were inspiring America. And today I want to look at one of those ancient Avengers, the prophet Elijah. Now consider an article from Adam Kirsch, who Dr. Trapedo just mentioned, that appeared last summer in the Wall Street Journal, titled The Power of Our New Pop Myths. Kirsch wrote that Marvel, Star Wars, and other franchises have become central to our culture by returning to a primal form of storytelling. He wrote, while narrative universes seem like a new development, having taken over the world in the 21st century, they actually represent a much older and more primal mode of storytelling. Like ancient myths and folk tales, and we would add the Bible, they offer not a single story, but a set of materials that can be used and reused by different storytellers for different purposes. And as we're going to see today, that's exactly what happened with the story of Elijah. Now, Kirsch laments what is lost in the biblical illiteracy that Rabbi Soloveichik referred to. He writes, today's narrative universes also resemble myths in bringing us face to face with fundamental mysteries of human life. Just like the Bible. Was I born for a purpose? And if so, how do I discover what that purpose is? Why does evil exist? What am I willing to give my life for? Traditionally, people look to religious and patriotic stories to answer such questions. But in 21st century America, those kinds of narratives no longer have the power to unite us. They are more likely to ignite suspicion and division. Popular culture has stepped into the gap, offering new myths that are less fraught and easier to share. And people, regretfully, are more familiar with Marvel and Star Wars than they are of the Bible. So what I want to show today is how centuries before Moon Knight, Kitty Pryde of the X-Men, and Fantastic Four's The Thing all had a l'chaim together in the pages of Marvel Comics, there was Elijah, America's Dark Knight. Now this is the actual Elijah symbol used to summon him. No, I'm just kidding. So, as you might know, just to refresh your memory, the prophet Elijah in the book of Kings is a fellow who had a habit of appearing and disappearing when you least expect him, not unlike Batman. He had the ability to declare famine, resuscitate dead children. He slaughtered 450 prophets of the pagan god Baal in a game of who worships the real true God. He rebuked the wicked King Ahab for stealing the vineyard of the innocent Naboth. And he heard God's still small voice in the King James translation, in the crack of a mountain. And he inspired his fellow Israelites to repent, and then he passed off his mantle, literally, to his successor, Elisha. Now, this figure, this ghost of Elijah, has actually hovered over many doors in America. It has entered many unexpected channels in the American political imagination. And I have this graphic of doors for a particular reason. Many of you might know that at the Passover Seder, there's a tradition both to have a cup of Elijah and to open the door expecting him to appear. Why do we do that? Because the Seder is a commemoration of the Exodus from Egypt, God's initial great national redemption, and we hope that by commemorating it, we will merit the ultimate redemption, the Messianic era. And so with Elijah, who is going to reappear as a harbinger of redemption, we hope that he's on the way, and our observation, our commemoration of Passover, is to bring him back to us. And so we actually pour him a cup and open the door. Now, I could swear that when I was a child, we poured the cup for Elijah all the way to the top. And by the time the Seder was over, I'm telling you, he drank this much. He was there. You could take it to the bank. In the meantime, we have a eulogy the day that George Washington passed away. Now, this was after John Adams was already America's second president, but there was their much contentious election of 1800 coming up. And so Samuel McGaw gave the following oration. Consolation is, he said, that your venerable chief, he's talking about George Washington, is not to be considered as moldering in dust and gone forever, but gone a little before, or surely invested with life unperishable. He's alluding to Elijah going up to heaven in a whirlwind. As the sage Franklin expressed on a valuable friend's decease, his carriage was first ready, his chariot, and he has gone before us. We could not all conveniently start together, and why should you and I be grieved at this, since we are soon to follow, and we know where to find him. He hath gone before you, he hath ascended like Elijah in his triumphal car, and bids us follow. But in the meantime, in case you're sitting shiva, you're lamenting the death of Washington, have no fear. His mantle carrier, his successor, has already been anointed. He hath left, meanwhile, an exalted portion of his spirit and his mantle to an Adams. In other words, it was almost a political campaign ad that said, I'm Elijah the prophet, and I endorse this message. Vote for John Adams. And in fact, he wasn't the only one. William Rogers, a Philadelphia preacher, said, like Elisha of old, may he, Adams, possess a double portion of the spirit and virtues of his once intimate, affectionate, but now entombed friend. So ironically, John Adams, a couple decades later, also evoked the story of Elijah, writing to Thomas Jefferson, who defeated him in that election. He said about Napoleon, a whirlwind raised him, and a whirlwind blowed him away to St. Helena. He's very confident that the age of reason is not past. This was a reference to Napoleon having said, when I was young, I was revolutionary from ignorance and ambition. At the age of reason, I have followed its counsels and my own instinct, and I have crushed the revolution. And so am I, continued Adams, but I hope that reason will never again rashly and hastily create such creatures as Napoleon. So he's saying, you don't want this guy to appear when you least expect him. It's not a good sign. Elijah was also used as a rebuke to the unjust. John Lewis, in a sermon in 1777, titled his talk, Naboth's Vineyard, and he argued that the British crown was unjustly stealing colonist property for personal gain, just like King Ahab had stolen the vineyard of Naboth. If you go visit the United States Capitol building, you see a very striking image titled The Apotheosis of Washington, which depicts George Washington ascended to heaven in a cloud, evoking the story of Elijah ascending to heaven in a whirlwind. Elijah appeared in various contexts over the fight over slavery and abolition. In 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, allowing for popular sovereignty to determine whether a state could have slaves or not. President Franklin Pierce, who supported the South on this issue, was criticized as, quote, a latter-day Ahab, deaf to the warnings of his Elijahs, the anti-Nebraska clergy. There was a letter from Fernando Wood, the former mayor of New York, to President Lincoln, urging him to make peace with the South, in which he wrote, your inaugural address pointed out with prophetic vision that after a bloody and terrible struggle, the still, small voice of reason would intervene and settle the controversy, evoking that story of Elijah. And lastly, Frederick Douglass praised the British emancipation of West Indies as having come not by the sword, but by the word, not by the brute force of numbers, but by the still, small voice of truth. Now, I'm not going to embarrass myself by singing publicly, but I would just note that the very famous song, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, written by a former slave, Wallace Willis, is a depiction in verse of Elijah's ascent into heaven, a symbol of national liberation, of proclaiming liberty, if you will, throughout the land. Elijah also supported the fight for equal rights in the 1900s. Francis James Grimke, a leading African-American clergy, wrote as follows, for years, he, Elijah, had labored hard for the reformation of his countrymen. He saw the people rushing headlong into idolatry and every form of wickedness, and under the direction and inspiration of the Almighty, he threw himself with all the energy and impetuosity of his nature into the work of reforming them. Elijah also supported lawyers, at least according to William Jennings Bryan, who had a graduation speech at Northwestern Law School said, "We need more Elijahs in the pulpit today, more men who will dare to upbraid an Ahab and defy a Jezebel." And Hillary Clinton, in her eulogy for the renowned civil rights leader Elijah Cummings, note his first name, said as follows, like his biblical namesake, quote, "He weathered storms and earthquakes, but never lost his faith, as he raised the next generation of leaders and even worked a few miracles." Elijah has also served as a self-help guru, as can be seen in Oprah Winfrey's commencement address at Harvard University, in which he said, "If you're willing to listen to, be guided by that still small voice that is the GPS within yourself, to find out what makes you come alive, you will be more than okay, you will be happy." Taking a prophet that had slaughtered 450 pagan priests and making him the author of the runaway bestseller feel-good self-help book of 2013. Elijah has also appeared, or maybe attempted to appear, in the White House. Now, the very first official, now traditional White House Passover Seder was created in 2008 by a young Obama staffer, an advanced staffer named Herbie Ziskin, and a couple of Jewish colleagues. And in recounting to The Guardian, having held the first Passover Seder, which they used a Seder plate donated by Sarah Netanyahu after they were firmly established in the White House, he said, quote, "Politics is always there," talking about the Seder table discussion. He told the UK's The Guardian, "but no more than around the table with all our families." Though, Ziskin joked, the difference is, you know Elijah isn't coming because he wouldn't get through the Secret Service. So whether or not people are aware of this thread throughout the American story, I think it's a story that needs to be told and needs to be broadcast. Here's Kirsch's conclusion. In an earlier America, most people were raised on the same stories from the Bible and U.S. history. Not all of these stories were true. George Washington probably didn't chop down a cherry tree, but what mattered for narrative purposes is that everyone was expected to know them, to know these stories. This gave storytellers a set of familiar themes to play with. When Herman Melville wrote Moby Dick, for instance, he could count on readers knowing the biblical story of Jonah, who was swallowed by a whale and lived to tell about it. By the way, I would pause to note that a runaway bestseller already optioned for a movie, published by MTV Entertainment Books, yes, this is evidently a thing, in the horror section of Barnes & Noble, yes, Barnes & Noble is still a thing, is a book called Whalefall. And Whalefall tells a story about a young man named Jay. Jay was angry at his father. His father was a conservationist. He liked to preserve stuff. And his father committed suicide. Jay goes to retrieve the body of his father, jumps into actually off the coast of California, where we are, and is swallowed by a whale. This book is optioned by Imagine Entertainment. Once the writer's strike is over, I'm sure it's coming soon to a theater near you. And 99.9% of the reviews have all missed that this book is a modern retelling of the Book of Jonah. In the 21st century, traditional religious and patriotic narratives have lost much of their power to unite us. It's doubtful whether any of today's mega franchises have produced works of art that will still be enjoyed centuries from now, the way we continue to return to ancient epics and tragedies. With the enormous popularity of narrative universes, show that no matter how much the world changes, what we need from our stories stays the same. So I think what we've seen today is that in Elijah, one of the Hebrew Bible's ancient avengers, Americans have found a harbinger of hope, a rebuker of the unrighteous, a hero of stillness amid fractured times. He continues to visit, stirring Americans to perceive in his cup their own redemptive possibilities. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you. How do I follow such fabulous colleagues? I've been sent here by the British to redeem the negative energy. And I'll begin by noting that it was just 2 months ago my family and I went to London to spend some time with my parents. And one day as we strode along the River Thames, we came face to face with a rather affecting piece of history. A bronze effigy of a man who was burned at the stake for defying Henry VIII and daring to translate the Bible into English, the 15th century theologian William Tyndale, who's been depicted in a recent BBC documentary as the most dangerous man in Tudor England. And in the moments before the flames on him were lit, the last words to leave his lips were, as you can see, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." And while my kids were less interested in this discussion, as I saw this statue, it put me in mind of other British figures whose legacies have been defined by the words that they said with their final breaths as they faced their execution. William Wallace, the Scottish knight who spent his life fighting for the right of political independence, is thought to have said a single word before his execution. Freedom. Thank you, Mel. Freedom. Guy Fawkes, an activist for Catholic toleration who participated in the plot to bomb the then Protestant and intolerant Houses of Parliament, is thought to have said right before his death, a desperate disease requires a dangerous remedy. But it was the son of the king that Fawkes conspired to kill, who was himself the only monarch in British history to be indicted, tried, and condemned to death on charges of treason. And Charles I, as he was led to be beheaded before a crowd outside Whitehall banqueting house, stood up, looked the public in the eyes, and said 9 striking words. He said, "A subject and a sovereign are clean, different things." And unlike Fawkes or Wallace or Tyndale, those final words failed to inspire a sense of empathy or sympathy within me. In fact, if I was standing there in the crowd on the fence about Charles's fate and then heard him saying that as king, he was fundamentally different from me, essentially better than me, innately nobler than me, I think that I may well have been swayed in favor of his execution. Which leads us to wonder what on earth he was thinking, and why even for a moment he imagined that his last words might inspire his audience to take his side. And for many, the answer lies in an inescapable inclination of the human mind that we all share. Imagine for a moment waking up on a morning like today's, but suffering from a very unusual species of amnesia, one that robs you of your ontology. Imagine that you remember the names of everything that you see, from bricks and bags to feet and hands, windows, walls, people, but you cannot identify value or worth. You cannot remember how to apportion importance. Studies suggest that as you took in the world's diversity as if for the first time, you would feel a deep unease at the panoramic and haphazard multiplicity. Because as it turns out, the human mind is primed to prefer design over disorder, to despise the unsystematic and organize the untidy. We as human beings, all of us, even the not neat ones of us, have a propensity to seek neat structures and engage in what the psychologist and historian Michael Shermer calls patternicity. In his book subtitled From Ghosts and Gods to Politics and Conspiracies, he writes quite simply that the brain is a belief engine. From the data flowing in through the senses, the brain naturally begins to look for and find patterns and then infuses those patterns with meaning. And it is this patternicity that led many, many centuries ago the poets and the philosophers of ancient Greece, among others in the ancient Near East, to see an innate hierarchy in nature. Stones were ranked from diamonds down to dirt. Trees were ranked from oak down to weeds. Animals from eagles to beetles. And of course, the hierarchy did not stop there. Human beings were ranked from strong to weak in this ladder of matter, which came to be called the great chain of being. And this great chain of being came to be seen by many Greeks and those who absorbed their thought as the divine design of the cosmos, comprised of a painstakingly meticulous hierarchy in which gold is essentially higher than steel, and lions are essentially higher than sheep, and kings are higher than the common people. This is where the very idea of the divine right of kings comes from. It is why 8 golden lions lie on the English monarch's coat of arms, along with the line, unfortunately in French, God and my right, Dieu et mon droit. And it is why the killing of King Charles was Charles I, for the record, don't want to get in trouble. It is why the killing of King Charles I was depicted as the felling of a royal oak, because to seek to unseat a king was seen as a protest against the divine design, an attack on the human being who was elected by heaven to rule, reign, and govern. And that is why, right before he died, Charles I looked the people in the eye and said, with the sincere expectation of engendering respect, a subject and a sovereign are clean, different things. But as you might imagine, the revolutionaries did not agree. And their conviction came from reading one of the most subversive and revolutionary books in human history, the one that Tyndale had dared to translate 2 centuries before the Bible. It was a book that Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks described as radical then, radical now. For a phrase that appears in the very first chapter, a sentence that he says heralded the greatest paradigm shift in the story of humankind. God made man in his own image, but not these slides with the right font. He goes on to write, the single proposition was an explosive charge at the base of the entire structure of the ancient and medieval world. And you'll have to take my word for it that he carries on to say, nothing could have been more counterintuitive. It would take a millennial effort to persuade people whose eyes had led their minds to value those with muscle, to see the inalienable worth of every single human being, no matter how physically strong or physically weak. And to that end, the text deploys what Robert Alter called the art of biblical narrative, telling a radically different kind of story than had occupied the tellers of ancient myth, where Greeks and Romans were regaled with stories of Hercules' 10 labors, the Hebrews read instead of Abraham's 10 tests and the divergent impressions left by those seemingly similar legends cannot be overstated. Because Hercules occupies a world of beasts and fights mythic creatures, lions, serpents, bulls, birds, and boars. His heroism is found in the capacity to ground fiends, bind hounds, and seize hinds, because all of Hercules' enemies are external, and his inner world remains static and unseen. But the drama of the Abrahamic labors unfolds not on the world stage, it takes place in the theater of his soul. All the monsters that Abraham faces are found within. His enemies are not the creatures of myth, but the beasts that live in the human heart: doubt, apathy, greed, fear, and impatience. Where Hercules' journey ends with him chaining the 3-headed Cerberus, Abraham's final test sees him resisting his own impulse to save his beloved son. The world of myth celebrates muscle and trains its listeners to lionize those who master others. The Hebrew Bible celebrates the triumphs of the mind and guides its readers to aspire most fundamentally to master the self. And these divergent narrative emphases, driven by radically incongruent ontologies, also promote a radically different political ideal. The mythic imagination, populated with superhuman heroes, supports a politics devoted to the establishment of hierarchy and the elevation of those born with power. The biblical imagination, populated with profoundly human heroes, supports a politics devoted to giving every person, no matter their station, the space and time and peace of mind to refine their senses and perfect themselves. And this biblically inspired idea of politics first fully emerged in the 17th century English, British Revolution. Yeah, we don't talk much about that, which literally turned the world upside down. And it was a moment, a revolution, at which John Milton sat at the very center. Born on Bread Street, the son of a scrivener, Milton went on to become the mouthpiece of the Commonwealth, which eliminated the English monarchy. Famously blind, he became the visionary who defended regicide and a century later inspired the American colonies to fight for their freedom. And it was his biblical sensibilities which recognized the divine dignity, sublime responsibility, and consequent right to liberty of every single human being that bolstered his political ideology. And he too, John Milton, went about making the case for revolutionary implications of an ancient faith through both prose and poetry, most famously in his biblical epic called Paradise Lost, indeed. And admitting that traditionally epic had been reserved for the grand battles hailed in Greek myth, he sought to pen the first of a kind. He claimed what had not yet been attempted in prose or rhyme. He sought to produce an epic in which the mettle of his protagonists would be tested not in needing to crush others, but in needing to restrain the self. In his words, which again you'll have to take my word for, he said, "War's hitherto the only argument heroic deemed, the better fortitude of patience and heroic martyrdom remain unsung." And by the end of his retelling of the failure of Adam and Eve, he has us see them, grasp the truth that heeding the senses' esteem for physical vigor, sweet taste, enchanting fragrance, and aesthetic beauty obscures their capacity to regulate themselves. In the words of Milton, soon they found their eyes how opened and their minds how darkened. And as a consequence of their failure to dominate the craving of the senses, Milton shows the sibling rivalry, martial contest, and political fissures which led free human beings to assert the great chain of being was unleashed upon the world. A devastating vision frustrating a God-given mission that would require Milton to end his epic by stating emphatically and unequivocally, "Man over men he made not Lord." And in Milton's political treatises, like the Tenure of Kings and Magistrates, which were penned in defense of the English Republic's contentions, he wrote, "No man who knows aught can be so stupid to deny that all men naturally were born free, being in the image and resemblance of God himself." And then, denying the need for monarchs and the very existence of a chain of being, he wrote, "They in whomsoever virtue dwells eminently need not kings to make them happy, but are the architects of their own happiness, and whether to themselves or others are not less than kings." And it was in these words written by a blind bard that, together with his Puritan peers, the match of the American spirit were lit, which led one early 19th century anthologist to write, "Milton is more emphatically American than any author who has lived in the United States." You'll have to forgive me for that one. Overwhelmingly, we have evidence that shows that Milton was read religiously by the framers of this nation, from John Adams and James Madison to Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson, who cited and relied upon him in both Common Sense and the Declaration of Independence. But there is one piece of material evidence which shows the extent of the connection between Milton's pen and American independence that calls us to continue to defend his legacy. At the back of a small chapel on the grounds of Westminster Abbey in London sits a wall of stained-glass windows depicting the central moments and the impact of Milton's life, and it was dedicated and paid for in 1888 by the Philadelphian philanthropist George Childs. We thank him for that. And at the bottom of the series of windows sits a couplet that I will highlight, that you will obviously be able to read from your chairs. And it was composed by one of America's so-called fireside poets, the Quaker and abolitionist John Greenleaf Whittier. And I have blown it up for you, not as Fawkes tried, but on the screen. And it reads, "The new world honors him whose lofty plea for England's freedom made her own more sure, whose song, immortal as its theme shall be, their common freehold, while both worlds endure." So though his work, including Paradise Lost, is regretfully now rarely read, the pen of this blind poet was at the head of a revolution that broke the great chain and went on to shape our age and the foundations of this nation. On the shoulder of giants, inspired by the Bible, Milton revolutionized the epic, reconfigured Western ethics, and reimagined modern politics, seeing every life as a divine gift in which the inalienable liberty is blessed with inner bliss hand in hand. Bret Stephens, the noted columnist, has on more than one occasion written that nobody is born with the habits of a free mind. They are difficult to learn and tempting to dismiss. So today, as we celebrate the Constitution and think of Milton's legacy, let us reflect on our responsibility, not only to protect and defend it, but to inspire others to do so as well. I wish you all a happy Constitution Day.
First, let us give thanks for these amazing presentations. I know Dr. Soloveichik has had to leave. We're just a bunch of friends here, so I will call on. Just feel free to, as we're getting mic'd up here for the video. And just a note on that, all of you who registered will, within the next few days, be getting a link to the YouTube video of all of these presentations. It's always a part of the way that we expand the impact of these events for those who come and get the links to the videos to share them out. And I hope you feel very free to send these around to your networks of friends because, again, just really terrific presentations. Thanks to each of you and to Rabbi Dr. Soloveichik, who's had to head out. So hands up for questions. Yes.
This may seem a little silly, but at my Passover Seder, we tell the story of Elijah when we fill the cup, that Elijah predicted that there wouldn't be any more Jewish people, and that the reason that we open the door is so that Elijah can come and see everybody sitting around the Seder table. And so how does that connect with your story?
So I think you might be thank you for the question, wonderful question. I think you might be referencing, I'm aware of a tradition that actually at the circumcision of a Jewish boy, we put out a chair called the chair of Elijah. And there, because exactly as you mentioned, Elijah essentially rebuked the Jewish people for not being faithful to the covenant, to the Brit. At every circumcision ceremony, covenantal ceremony, God says, you go sit here and see how loyal they are to your covenant. So absolutely, thank you so much.
And we should always be loyal to Brits, is what I get from that.
Agree to disagree.
Questions? Yeah, where are you put? Yes, Mackenzie.
I have to run to class, but I do have a question. So I've noticed it's become increasingly popularized for a figurative reading of the Bible. And so I'm curious about the literal readings of the Bible versus the figurative reading of the Bible in terms of political life. Does it matter for the political question, figurative reading versus literal?
Interesting. So, I'll jump on that. You said you have to run, so very quickly. My area of expertise goes up to about 1599, so I can't really address. No, I'm joking. But for real, in terms of the figurative versus literal, Rabbi Lerner mentioned William Tyndale earlier, and one of the things that he writes in the preface to his translation of the Bible is that you should read the Bible to read it as if each syllable pertaineth to yourself. And to suck out the pith of meaning. And even in that way, it's kind of recommending both to read in both directions, attentive to every single syllable, so you really have to understand the very literal meaning and all of its implications, but also at the same time be mindful of figuring and enacting and living that out in your own life. So, I guess it's sort of funny for me to turn to Tyndale in that sense, but he's the writer that I think, and the translator that comes to mind when that question's asked.
If I could piggyback on that, I would refer you to a couple of wonderful books by the academic James P. Byrd. He has one called Sacred Scripture, Sacred War, and another called The Holy Baptism of Fire and Blood. And he goes through sermons in the first book in the American Revolution and the second in the Civil War, and how the Bible was used to represent, beyond the story of the Israelites, the own political moments of the day. So he has a wonderful bit where he talks about how in the story in the beginning of the book of Joshua, the Israelites surprisingly lose a battle. They weren't used to losing when they were conquering the land. And it turns out the Israelites ask the Urim V'Tumim, ask the oracle, God's oracle, why did we lose? And it turns out that there was a fellow named Achan who had stolen from prohibited items. He took something that wasn't allowed to him at the previous battle. His name is identified through a lottery, and he is promptly executed. But what was fascinating, as Byrd documents, is that the North and South both accused the other of being Achan. The South said to the North, you're trying to take away our slaves. That's property that doesn't belong to you. You guys are Achan trying to seize what doesn't belong to you. Whereas the North said, well, you taking slaves in the first place, they don't belong to you. You guys are Achan. And so it's a fascinatingly resonant and ripped from the headlines type of reading that they utilized in their own political day. And so my own, sort of, I guess, scholarly interest, you could say, is how it was received as a almost current political text.
Yes.
I have a question, I think for you, Dr. Halpern, but the others might be able to augment it. The Covenantal Society, what a wonderful understanding. But our document is covenantal.
Absolutely.
And I'm wondering why there wasn't a little bit more emphasis on Abraham, the covenant, the circumcision, Sodom and Gomorrah, and the birth of Isaac. Because it's so literal in a beautiful way. It lays it all out for us.
Absolutely.
Of importance of family and nation.
Absolutely. So thank you so much. So I'd love to be invited back to give a talk on. I would just note that speaking of covenant and even covenant renewal, Rabbi Soloveichik noted that we blow the shofar on the upcoming holiday of Rosh Hashanah. So one of the readings of why we do that is because a shofar was blown when a king was crowned. So we are actually recrowning God. It's a covenant renewal ceremony. And I would note that in America, we actually do have this roughly once every 4 years, and that's a presidential inaugural address. And I was lucky enough to co-write with Dean Peterson's good friend and our new colleague, Dr. Tevi Troy, a piece called God at the Inauguration in the Wall Street Journal, where we noted that in this covenant renewal of America, you could take it to the bank that the president is going to quote the Bible. And spoiler alert, there hasn't yet been a Jewish president, but more often than not, it's going to be from the Hebrew Bible specifically. And when we pitched it to the editor of the journal, they said, well, that's a very nice idea. Let's see if Biden actually does it, and then you guys react to that. And sure enough, he quoted the book of Psalms in his inaugural address. I actually predicted that he would quote, each shall sit under his vine and fig tree, and none shall make him afraid, which is a favorite verse of George Washington. And I was off by one. Amanda Gorman actually quoted that verse in her poem at the inaugural address. So just stay tuned for whoever is inaugurated or re-inaugurated, and you can bet that they will be quoting the Bible.
Yes.
So just a touch of irony, my birthday is September 17th, Constitution Day. But my question and my comment is thank you so much for connecting the dots in our Judeo-Christian evolution as a nation and the Hebrew Bible. And I wanted to ask what your opinion is of Isaiah 33:22 and its relation to the beginning of our three-party system, or checks and balances rather. For the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, and the Lord is our king. It is he who will save us. So there we have the three branches of government: judicial, executive, and presidential.
Legislative.
Yeah. So in his writings, I believe it's Rabbi Sachs notes that actually you don't even need to get all the way to Isaiah in the book of Deuteronomy, which we're reading currently in the weekly Torah portion. There's a special commandment for the king, the monarch, to actually carry with him a Sefer Torah, a Torah scroll, to remind him that he is not the ultimate authority. Unlike Charles I, he doesn't believe that he's actually better off on some higher level of humanity. So there's even that reminder, even then, that in the political leader does not lie ultimate judicial authority. Thank you for noting.
A couple more questions. Yes, Russ.
Question for Dr. Trapedo. I was, and I bet many people in the room were captivated by the Basal book and its role. How prevalent was it, as in geographically? How prevalent was it, as in time-wise?
Sure.
And relative to how many people would have a full copy of the Old Testament or New Testament as opposed to just a Psalm book?
Sure. So it's so interesting that the Basal book, it kind of wonder, why don't we have more copies of it? 1,700 originally printed, only 11 survives. And I think that actually is kind of, through negation, evidence of how much it was used. I mean, think about the books at your house that get used the most. They're the ones that kind of deteriorate the quickest. So it was really extensively run. It was also very full of many, many mechanical errors and typos. Because if you think about it, the original printer wasn't there to run the process. And so when they went to redo it, because there were so many typos, I mean, there were pages that had arrows that said flip back to and then go in the other direction, that they wound up having to redo it just for greater accuracy. But it was the predominant book until needs required that it needed to be kind of updated version, but extensive. Yeah, certainly.
Well, good. Yes, Bob.
Yeah, I'll throw this out to anybody. Who were these Jews that were here in America at the time the founding fathers were making the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution? Because did they come out of England, or were these Eastern European and Ashkenazis that came over? Who were these people? I mean, there were only a couple of thousand.
Sure.
In the entire population.
Correct, right. They were Spanish Portuguese Jews landed in Recife, and there were very few Jews around the time of the American independence, around 2000, as you mentioned. I would note, as Rabbi Soloveichik has taught me, that I don't know if you're familiar with this phenomenon, but Jews like to argue. I mean, has anyone, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, there has to be the synagogue you don't pray at. So it seems that when George Washington became the first president of the United States, each faith community sent him a letter of congratulations. Okay? There were 2,000 Jews in the whole country, only 2,000. 3 letters. 3 letters, because no one could agree on who represented the Jews. So we were few in number, but many in arguments.
Thank you, and enjoy the game.
Thank you so much. I'm going to the Dodgers-Padres tonight. We were talking about that. But I'm a Yankees fan.
One more question. You have one more? Well, please join me. Did we have one?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead. Jackson?
Thank you all for speaking so much today. My name is Jackson. I'm a student here at SPP. I'll open my question to all of you because they just touched on different ways through the presentations. But there was this discussion about this idea of the cultural relevance of biblical stories and allegory impacts on literature and the founding documents. And it was also suggested that perhaps that shared importance culturally and socially in the United States, it has started to wane in favor of news stories, like the Marvel comics or what have you. I'm wondering if you see any connection between the waning influence of biblical stories and allegory for our culture, our education, and increased calls for the separation of church and state, not as a functional matter, not establishing a formal state, but I feel there are even increased calls to not allow any sort of religious belief or influence in our policy-making process.
Do you have any thoughts?
Thank you, Jackson, for the question. As I say, I come from Britain originally, and even though we got started on a few things earlier, we sometimes follow the American trends late. But in this instance, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who's come up a few times, has noted what started in Europe is starting to happen here as well, that there has been this shift away from commitment to religion, in a sense that religion is what's holding us back in the West, that it makes us primitive and combative, and it stops us from advancing and progressing as we should. The claims that we've been making is that is a complete misconception, and that actually if we want to keep the West advancing and progressing and defending the liberties of every individual, we need to hold on to these stories. And what I was suggesting, quoting Michael Sherman and others, is that actually what often is taken for granted by those who see religion as an obstacle is not natural at all. To put it as simply as possible, it is not normal to be nice to other people. It is not normal to think that people who are not me deserve my attention and esteem and respect. And it is only through telling stories that we believe dearly from the biblical background, promote care for every single human being as implanted with the image of God, deserve our attention and protection, to be uplifted and attended to, that we're going to perpetuate this system. And that's why it's so important to fight for these stories to come back, not on a, forgive the terminology, a crusade of some sort, but to save what everybody agrees we want, just that we disagree on the method. And the turn towards these heroes, as Dr. Halpern mentioned, is the re-emerging of this attachment to these pagan myths where we celebrate muscle and might and power and gold, which does not promote progress that cares for every single individual. So yes, it's a disturbing trend. Rabbi Sachs actually, talking of eulogies, didn't give a eulogy for Washington, but gave a eulogy for Europe about 10 years ago, saying that the soul of Europe had died, which came as a surprise to many in Europe. But it is a starting trend that if you move away from the foundations of the faith, other values will creep in its place that are more natural, which are combative and self-promoting and narcissistic. So yes, it's a disturbing trend that we are on Constitution Day celebrating the efforts to push back against.
And if I could tie that back into the previous question about covenantal responsibility, Kirsch notes in the article that I cited, Harry Potter doesn't ask you to do anything. Marvel comics have no sense of mitzvah, of commandedness. There's no sense of responsibility that Rabbi Lerner so eloquently articulated. And so I think that's also what's lost when these stories are lost.
What a great note to end on. Thanks so much. Let's give thanks to our panel. So as we close, I just have 3 items here. Fourth, if you'll allow me, one brief digression, and he really did not want me to do this, but this relationship that is being formed between these two coastal institutions, these two lighthouses, was brought about by my dear friend Michael Halpern from the law school, who is back there in the corner. He is the tie that binds us, and Michael, again, thank you for beginning this incredible relationship and one that will continue. So thank you for that. Three things. Number one, these have been put on your tables, these declarations and constitutions. Many of you are...
I apologize to Rabbi Lerner. Microaggression if you wave the Declaration of Independence in front of him.
Oh, that's right.
I'm wearing American flag cufflinks.
Oh, there we go. There we go. Some of you are saying to yourself, I have 5 of these at home. Well, bring home a 6th and give it to someone who you don't think has it. This is an important document, and here we are on Constitution Day, celebrating the importance of it. So that's one. Number 2, Psalm 23 has been cited several times. For those of you who this may be your first visit up here to the Drescher part of campus, before you leave, and especially on this 9/11 week, I would commend you to take a short walk across the way to the Heroes Garden. The Heroes Garden was created in commemoration of a business school alum who was killed on Flight 93, was opened on 9/11/2004. And as you follow the steps up, you'll naturally walk through several different poignant quotations from around that time. But as you leave and take the pathway out, every other stone you'll see is a different passage from Psalm 23. And when life gets a little crazy for me, I've found that is just a meditative walk to take that trip both into and seeing the fountain there, but also walking back out and taking the steps and reading each verse from Psalm 23, which I think is such an important and powerful story and set of images. Third and final, this is not the only thing. Obviously, this Constitution Day, very important. The 9/11 memorial on Monday, very important. But on this Sunday, the School of Public Policy is celebrating something we're calling Civic Sunday, which is an opportunity to bring several scholars to campus. We're targeting one class for middle schoolers. So if you have a middle schooler in your life, we have a civics education class that's going to be looking at the Declaration and the American Constitution. But then for parents, and all of you can be invited to this portion of it, we're going to have some education activists talk about how the education system works here, K-12, and some opportunities to learn about how you can be better engaged in your child's or grandchild's education. So that's going to be here on Sunday at 1 o'clock from 1 till 4, and it really is a great bookend to a series of important events here on campus. So thank you so much for your patience and for your joining in with us, and thank you again to our speakers in this great relationship with the Straus Center. Thank you all.